Donald Trump issued 5 specific demands to Canada. He framed them as necessary conditions for continued cooperation. He presented them as non-negotiable. He expected compliance. Mark Carney rejected every single one, not through public spectacle, not through rhetorical escalation, through systematic refusal backed by institutional confidence. Because this was never a negotiation. This was a test of leverage. And the results are now clear. This is no longer about whether Canada will comply. This is about whether Trump's pressure strategy has any credibility left. Welcome back to Canada Today. Tonight, we are breaking down what may become a defining moment in the Trump-Carney dynamic. According to reports from Washington and Ottawa, the White House presented Canada with 5 concrete demands: trade deficit reduction targets, increased defense spending commitments, enhanced border security cooperation, expanded energy exports to the United States, and coordination on Arctic sovereignty issues. Each demand was positioned as essential. Each carried an implicit threat. And Mark Carney rejected all 5. Let's walk through what happened. The demands were delivered through diplomatic channels following weeks of escalating rhetoric. The timing matters. These demands came after Trump's tariff threats had lost public support, after congressional pushback on the Gordie Howe Bridge, and after Republican defections on tariff votes. These demands were issued from a weakened position, not a strengthened one. That distinction is critical. The first demand concerned trade deficit reduction. Trump claimed Canada exploits the United States through unfair trade practices and demanded commitments to reduce the bilateral imbalance within a specified time frame. The problem is structural. Canada and the United States have deeply integrated supply chains. Manufactured goods cross the border multiple times during production. Trade deficits here are evidence of integration, not unfairness. Carney's response was direct. Canada would not accept arbitrary numerical targets that ignore economic reality. The second demand involved defense spending. Trump insisted that Canada increase its NATO commitments to levels comparable with other alliance members. This is not new. It has been recurring for years. What makes it problematic is the framing. Trump presented it as a condition for trade access, linking security to economic leverage. Defense policy is determined by strategic assessments, not trade pressure. Carney rejected the premise. The third demand focused on border security. Trump called for enhanced cooperation on immigration enforcement, expanded information sharing, and joint operations. On the surface, this appears reasonable, but the specifics revealed a different agenda. The demand included provisions that would subordinate Canadian immigration policy to U.S. enforcement priorities. It required stricter asylum processing aligned with American standards and database access without reciprocal transparency. Carney's position was clear. Canada would cooperate on security. It would not surrender sovereignty over immigration. The fourth demand targeted energy exports. Trump insisted that Canada guarantee expanded oil and natural gas shipments at preferential rates. He framed this as mutual benefit. The reality is different. Guaranteed exports at fixed prices would lock Canada into commitments that reduce flexibility in global markets. It would prioritize American energy security over Canadian economic strategy. Carney rejected this framework. Canada's energy sector operates within market principles, not as a captive supplier. The fifth demand addressed Arctic sovereignty. Trump called for joint U.S.-Canada coordination on Arctic territorial claims, resource development, and military presence. This demand is particularly revealing. The Arctic represents one of the most strategically significant regions for Canada's future. It involves territorial integrity, indigenous rights, resource access, and climate security. Trump's demand was not about cooperation, it was about influence. Carney's response was unambiguous. Canada's Arctic policy is non-negotiable. Sovereignty in the North is a core national interest. It will not be subject to external pressure. Now consider the pattern: 5 demands, 5 rejections. But more importantly, consider what those rejections reveal. Trump issued these demands expecting leverage. He expected that economic pressure and tariff threats would force compliance. That expectation was based on a fundamental miscalculation. It assumed Canada had no alternatives. It assumed Ottawa would prioritize short-term relief over long-term autonomy. It assumed wrong. Mark Carney's strategy has been consistent. Diversify trade relationships, strengthen institutional resilience, build coalitions with like-minded governments, refuse to reward bullying, and allow Trump's overreach to generate consequences. That strategy is now producing results. Each rejection was supported by economic data, legal frameworks, and international partnerships. Carney did not simply say no. He built the capacity to make no sustainable. The response from Washington has been telling. Initially, there was silence. Then came defensive statements describing the demands as proposals rather than ultimatums. Then officials began framing the rejections as ongoing discussions. This is damage control. When an administration shifts from demanding compliance to describing rejection as dialogue, leverage has shifted. Congressional reaction has been significant. Republican senators from border states have questioned the utility of demands that damage cooperation. Democratic lawmakers have criticized the approach as counterproductive. Business groups have warned that confrontation threatens supply chains and jobs. This is institutional recognition that the strategy failed. When your own coalition distances itself from your demands, you no longer control the narrative. Economically, the rejections expose a deeper problem. Trump's trade strategy relies on the assumption that other countries need American markets more than America needs theirs. That works only if the target has no alternatives. Canada has spent months building alternatives. Trade agreements with Europe have expanded. Asian markets have opened. Domestic investment has increased. Each development reduces Trump's leverage, and each rejection demonstrates that leverage has diminished. What makes this moment strategically significant is not just that Carney rejected the demands. It is that he rejected them without triggering escalation. Trump could impose new tariffs. He could intensify rhetoric. He could threaten additional measures. But each of those actions would come with higher costs than before. Public support is lower. Congressional patience is thinner. Economic data is weaker. Business criticism is louder. Escalation is no longer a show of strength. It is a sign of desperation. Trump built his political brand on the idea that he wins negotiations through dominance. He frames compromise as weakness. He treats diplomacy as submission. That framework requires visible victories. It requires other leaders backing down. It requires demonstrations of power. 5 rejections do not fit that narrative. 5 rejections suggest that the other side is not intimidated. 5 rejections reveal that the dominance framework has limitations. And once those limitations become visible, the entire strategy loses credibility. Mark Carney did not need to make a public spectacle of these rejections. He did not need to mock Trump. He did not need to escalate. He simply needed to demonstrate that Canada's position is sustainable. That demonstration is now complete, because sustainable refusal is more powerful than temporary confrontation. It signals that the relationship has fundamentally changed. It shows that pressure no longer produces compliance, and it forces the other side to recalibrate. For Trump, this is a defining test. He can continue issuing demands and watching them get rejected. He can escalate and face greater domestic opposition. Or he can retreat and admit that his approach failed. None of these options are politically attractive. Each carries significant costs, and that is precisely the point. Carney's strategy was never about winning individual confrontations. It was about creating a situation where continued confrontation becomes unsustainable for the other side. The 5 demands were supposed to establish dominance. Instead, they exposed limits. They were supposed to force Canada into submission. Instead, they demonstrated independence. They were supposed to prove Trump's leverage. Instead, they revealed its erosion. This is not rhetoric. This is strategic reality. When a leader issues demands and those demands are systematically rejected without consequence, power has shifted. Trump attempted to dictate terms. Carney rejected them. Trump expected capitulation. Carney provided refusal. Trump sought validation of his pressure tactics. Carney delivered evidence of their failure. The 5 demands were a test. The 5 rejections were the result. And the result is now visible to anyone watching. This is no longer about trade. This is about credibility. And credibility is measured not by the loudness of demands, but by the sustainability of outcomes. If you value fact-based analysis and strategic clarity, subscribe to Canada Today. We track power, consequences, and reality. Because sometimes the most important story is not what was demanded. It is what was rejected.